Question for you. Why would Harvard professor Avi Loeb, who's one of the most respected physicists in the world and a tenured director of the Institute for Theory and Computation at the Center for Astrophysics, say that Harvard has become more of a police organization? When one enters a crime scene, little often needs to be said. That's because the problem is so apparent already. The primary question is not what happened, but who did this? Nonetheless, since many people are still at the what happened stage about Harvard, let me try to tell the truth about our current situation. The historic levels of grade inflation on campus also match historical levels of denial, insularity, truth inflation, and ideological capture. For instance, a shorter version of this heterodox message you're viewing at this moment was rejected by the Harvard Crimson. The well meaning editor told me they didn't feel this particular piece was a good fit at this particular time. I wondered when exactly would be a good time. Faculty job applicants already have to do diversity and DE, and students can't speak their mind in an academic institution. Openness to dissenting voices and free inquiry are as rare at Harvard as is spotting the mythical dodo bird of the Ivy League in Harvard Yard, a student who's working class, conservative, religious, rural in origin, heterosexual, and believes their gender matches their biological sex. Let's step back and ask the question of what is a university supposed to be in the first place? A secular university is supposed to be a non-sectarian place with a primary purpose of the pursuit of truth, come what may. Any idea or theory, no matter how sacred or taboo or orthodox, should be up for intellectual scrutiny. It should employ freedom of inquiry on any academic question and use meritocratic and rational, not ad hominem, standards for assessment of ideas. Universities are supposed to be places where everyone is judged as an individual based on their actual contributions to truth seeking and not based on their group membership or whether the results of their research are socially and ideologically acceptable. In a university, a diversity of viewpoints and ideas should be sought out primarily so that one may better pursue the truth and eliminate falsehoods and errors, regardless of which bodies and brains those ideas originate from. Period. Now, what would be the opposite of this vision of an institution? Consider a partisan think tank that is explicitly factional and partial in its aims. There are many think tanks in America that have explicitly partisan aims and practices. For example, the Center for American Progress, which is liberal, Claremont Institute, which is conservative, the Cato Institute, which is libertarian, the Guttmacher Institute, which is pro-abortion, etc. These are all intellectually oriented places, and they produce often robust scholarship, but these are not exactly universities. Why is that? Because consistent with their ideologies, these institutes tend to only ask a very small range of all possible intellectual questions, and their answers are more predictable than not. So, for example, the Guttmacher Institute rarely does a study on post-traumatic stress disorder and moral injury after abortions, and the Cato Institute, which is more libertarian, rarely writes reports documenting the needs of the most vulnerable in society and how social safety nets may or may not help. So Harvard University, by these standards, is much more like a left-wing progressive institute than it is like the ideal of the university. In its more passionate moral exhortations, Harvard resembles a secular ideological church. There are some quantitative pockets of flourishing, nonpartisan academic life, but in general, Harvard does not really live up to the values of a university. And it's really more like a think tank. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, as everyone eventually worships something in whatever ideology they're in, and radical left-wing thought, if you can just look beyond its history of barbarism in practice, has a number of moral truths that I and many others would endorse, such as the importance of helping the dispossessed and unfortunate. There are many exemplary think tanks in America, and Harvard could be one of them. But most people in America and the world don't really know the truth about Harvard. They think it's more like a university. So we have a problem here. Now, how did this happen? I believe that most people at Harvard, faculty and students alike, are good-natured people devoted to learning and teaching and scholarship. They mean well. However, as devoted, expressive individualists, they've buckled under the weight of heroic self-creation and have been lured into an all-encompassing, creeping secular religion with its mask of compassion. Now, this ideology, whatever you want to call it critical social justice, wokeism, identitarian, neo-Marxism, whatever you want to call it, it takes advantage of people's atomized state, their baseline trait agreeableness, their breathlessness from lost meaning from traditional sources, such as sacrificial responsibilities in marriage, parenthood, faith, and citizenship. And this secular religion is intrinsically anti-Semitic anti-Asian, anti-white, sexist against males, and heterophobic, and more. This cultural revolution, which has happened in the last few decades in America, resembles past great awakenings of religious fervor in American history. It has been referred to as the Great Awakening. Its effects have been felt in many institutions in America, but Harvard is in many ways ground zero. Cambridge, Massachusetts is the Wuhan of the woke mind virus. Now back to Harvard. It's important to know that except for the hard sciences and their cousin departments where mathematical reasoning and statistical evidence predominate, Harvard is not primarily committed to the disinterested pursuit of truth. In its admissions, hiring, research, teaching, and administrative practices and goals, Harvard chiefly values political and social orthodoxy and outcomes consistent with those norms to filter people in scholarship and teaching. Just join a faculty meeting or a student discussion room or an administrator's conference room. Truth seeking too often takes the backseat to competition towards orthodox thinking or ritualized virtue signaling. In academic discussions, and even in the results of research and scholarship, there are often these implicit and sometimes explicit post hoc rationalizations that aim to meet ideological ends. Now, this is not in every single corner of the university, but it does happen in enough corners to create a culture of orthodoxy, with taboos, blasphemy, heretics, a secular liturgy, and worst of all, a stultifying and perpetual fear of wrongthink, and a fear of being found out to be unworthy within that dominant orthodox culture. Most people admit that the problems of this kind of pious insularity and born again cult like thinking and behavior are indeed more pervasive and severe in the humanities and the social sciences, which research has consistently shown are the most radicalized. For instance, in 2022, Harvard disinvited the philosopher Devin Buckley from speaking at the English department when her blasphemous views on transgenderism were found out, even though she was scheduled to speak on an unrelated arcane philosophical topic. Buckley is a feminist herself, but not sufficiently radicalized for Harvard. Here we see the 99.9 percentile of the radical left canceling the insufficiently orthodox mere 75th percentile leftist. Another recent example is the case of the African-American Harvard Law School professor Ronald Sullivan, who is a Democrat and provided legal representation to a very distasteful and famous man accused at the time of sexual violence. Soon thereafter, Professor Sullivan had a mob form against him, and Sullivan was canceled and forced to step down from his job as faculty dean of Winthrop at Harvard. He had to explain to his 9-year-old son how to interpret the left-wing KKK-esque spray painting of, quote, "Down with Sullivan," which appeared on the wall next to his home and was spray painted by some true believer radical, intending to intimidate and terrorize Sullivan and his family where they lived. Writing in the New York Times, Sullivan explained the content of this political vandalism to his son by saying, quote, "that representing unpopular clients serves an important constitutional role in our democracy, and that I had done nothing wrong. As you might imagine, it was hard to see my son read that piece of graffiti. The administration said and did nothing in response to the vandalism." Sullivan concluded that, quote, "unchecked emotion has replaced thoughtful reasoning on campus. Feelings are no longer subjected to evidence, analysis, or empirical defense. Angry demands rather than rigorous arguments now appear to guide university policy," end quote. So yes, my dear colleague, this is pretty much what people observe it's like when they're in a religious cult. Welcome to the revolution. And again, here, just like the case of Devin Buckley, is another case where the 99th percentile of the radical left has canceled the insufficiently orthodox, merely 75th percentile leftist. Now, you might find it hilarious to observe this self-cannibalization that results among these radicals competing for this trophy of most puritanical progressive. The zealotry is really no laughing matter. Students and faculty and knowledge itself is systematically corrupted for generations with this kind of culture. Entire fields of inquiry become unreliable and useless to those outside of this ideological cult. Perhaps the most famous example at Harvard is the case of President Lawrence Summers, who presented a wrongthink paper in a 2005 academic conference talk. While also mentioning two other competing hypotheses, Summers cited a third empirically well-supported hypothesis in the social sciences about greater male variability at extreme ends of population distributions as explaining some portion of sex differences in representation in the sciences at top universities. Now, this happened not at some fundamentalist meeting in the 16th century at the Kabul Institute for Advanced Islamic Studies, where somebody was presenting a non-orthodox hypothesis on the nature of the Quran. It was an academic conference in the social sciences in the 21st century in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Nonetheless, similar fundamentalist dynamics ensued and spasmodic protests against Summers emerged, and soon thereafter he was no longer president of Harvard. As a result of this high-status persecution, just imagine how much research and teaching of sex differences was never proposed or published in the social or medical sciences since 2005. How many scholars were never hired who would have studied these things, given their blasphemous views, despite how important sex differences are for understanding human nature and the human experience? Any mildly reasonable scholar would conclude, hey, if that's what happens to the president of Harvard, I better study or teach a different topic. Now, are these problems of ideological capture and radicalization limited just to the humanities and social sciences? Definitely not. So perhaps in your mind, you cleave these non-serious departments and factions off as you would a rotten part of an apple that you can nibble around with convenience. Unfortunately, the worm at the core of this fruit has spread, and the rot has left very little that's nutritious and left to consume. The entire academic culture has been spoiled, and now is festering under its frothing dogmatic mold. And it's even undermined parts of the sciences themselves. To give you a couple of examples, honorable and brilliant faculty like Kit Parker in engineering, Carol Hoven in evolutionary biology, Tyler Vanderweel in epidemiology. These people have all been persecuted for wrongthink at Harvard by mobs of convulsing left-wing fundamentalists just for freely expressing reasonable and well-argued non-radical left-wing ideas. For example, Professor Parker had his course canceled because students didn't find his reading list included enough radical left-wing explanations. I thought professors determined what was on their courses. Professor Parker believes the university has been taken over by left-leaning activists. Now remember, these harassments and cancellations have happened not in grievance studies departments, teaching me-search seminars on things like intersectional autoerotic ethnography of the semiotics of self-oppression. Rather, these things have conspired in extremely quantitative and scientific fields in the natural and biomedical sciences, engineering, evolutionary biology, and epidemiology. So everyone, please wake up. This is a huge problem. I would suggest that anyone who thinks these oppressive, puritanical dynamics are limited to the humanities and social sciences, I would suggest you go to the Harvard Medical School campus and look for the portraits that used to exist of all of the famous scientists and physicians over the centuries who contributed heroically and devoted every waking moment to discovering cures and unlocking mechanisms of disease that have saved millions of lives. Their portraits have been taken down for being too white, too Jewish, too male, too heterosexual. The same type of cancellation of dead and brilliant scholars has happened in the Harvard Economics Department in their portraits in the Littauer Center for Public Administration, as well as in Harvard's Department of Psychology and William James Hall, where powerful woke leaders felt students needed to be protected from looking at the faces of brilliant scholars that were too Jewish and too white and too male and too straight. This is incredibly unfair. And the reason is because genius by definition is non-egalitarian. The universe does not have a DEI department. There's no affirmative action for getting universe-shattering discoveries. Truth is a jealous God that inherently says no to most of us who want to wrestle away secrets, no matter our immutable characteristics or our ideology. True brilliance is so rare on this earth and is as consequential as it is hard to find. Innovative discoveries are so impossible to uncover, and authentically world-changing research is so hard to fake. So framing a single portrait representing a lifetime of sacred dedication and discovery is the least Harvard can do to show respect for its rare scholarly gems that have changed the world through genuinely meritorious and life-changing discoveries, no matter what their representation is in the population, no matter what the nature of their melanin or gonads or sexual proclivities are. Instead, Harvard basically says, never mind all that. By fiat or from on high, poof, revisionist history wins. Projectionary presentism wins. The lazy way to make us all the same wins. Kurt Vonnegut's handicapper general is in charge. The radicals are not content with merely deplatforming the living and breathing heretics and apostates among us. Even the dead have been canceled for being too white, too Jewish, too male, too heterosexual. Now, this is not only racist and sexist and heterophobic to white people, Jews, men, heterosexuals, etc. It's also very demeaning to minority scholars who replace these pale and male and straight visages That's because the process of cancellation suggests that the portraits were not earned, but politically forced. Now, what if Olympic medals were awarded in this manner? Say a bunch of Asians or whites or Jews were given Olympic medals in this manner to Asians or whites or Jews to make them feel more welcome amidst the more athletic bodies of persons of minority ancestry when they walk into a stadium to compete. Obviously, our pot-bellied gold medalists would know in their hyperlipidemic heart that the medal around their neck was political and not meritorious. The same is true in the academic sphere. It's incredibly insulting to minorities and patronizing and demonstrates the soft bigotry of low expectations. But perhaps you're not concerned, but you should be, because you'll be next. If you're not Jewish or Asian or white or male or heterosexual, perhaps you're something else considered oppressive, such as being attractive. You're guilty of lookism privilege. Perhaps you're not infertile. You're guilty of fertility privilege. The list never ends. So if you don't fight this ideology on campus today, you should know that you'll be eaten by this ideology eventually. Because to keep churning, the revolution needs to consume a continual supply of microaggression fodder. What about diversity? Isn't diversity a good thing? Well, it depends on diversity of what. At Harvard, diversity is superficial and merely skin and gonads deep, as everyone looks different but thinks basically alike. Look at any survey of Harvard's faculty and students on their political beliefs, and you'll see a monoculture that makes the Mormon church seem diverse in its viewpoints. This is what a Mormon colleague at Harvard told me. For example, in 2023, 30% of 18 to 29-year-olds in America say that they are very conservative or conservative on social issues. At Harvard, it's 6.4%. And according to 2022 data, only 3.4% of students have a favorable view of Donald Trump. Among students, there's approximately 900% more very liberal versus very conservative students. 900%. So the approximate ratio of very conservative to very progressive is a whopping 10 to 1. Now, there is data to support the stereotype that conservatives have on average a lower IQ. They're less intelligent than liberals. And that liberals are on average more neurotic and more likely to be mentally ill. We may expect non-one-to-one representation in elite universities where an IQ of around 130 is the average, meaning that in a meritocratic selection process, you wouldn't have one-to-one representation of conservatives and liberals. But a 900% difference is far from a non-echo chamber in intellectual discourse on any topic of social or moral concern in a university. This imbalance explains why radical left-wing protesters are disproportionately disrupting classrooms with screaming, occupying the Widener Library and harassing people who are trying to study during finals, occupying university administrative buildings, and so on. There's no Mormons doing this. There's no Orthodox Jews doing this kind of thing. Now, just take a minute and imagine what would happen if the causes that these radicals were proselytizing on behalf were right-wing causes. Then what would happen? Imagine, for example, if a mob of Mormon or Orthodox Jewish students, if they ever existed, started harassing everyone around them in classrooms and libraries and administrative buildings to start praying more, divesting from abortion clinics, while everyone's trying to study for finals. Everyone would be arrested in a few minutes by the Harvard police and probably involuntarily placed in hospitals for urgent psychiatric evaluation. But this doesn't happen if you're protesting for a radical left-wing cause. If you do that, then deans will bring you food as you occupy University Hall. So there's a huge double standard here. Now, how did this happen in the first place? How did this huge monoculture evolve? Well, a primary cause of this identity-based neo-Marxist orgy is the Harvard admissions office discriminating against non-progressive students. If you ask any college counselor, it's obvious that among equally qualified students academically, those with progressive stories are more likely to be accepted. In admissions reviews, saying, I worked on opening the Mexican border will get you bonus points, which if you say, I worked on securing the Mexican border, you're going to be penalized. Every admissions counselor knows this, and so do most students who are applying to colleges and graduate school. Therefore, student applicants obsessively researching schools know this better than us. Akin to an aspiring pastor writing for admission to a seminary, Harvard applicants spin a self-ideology congenial to the pedagogy of their press and fudge and nudge their salvific narratives and missionary-like extracurriculars towards left-wing orthodoxy tales that rival the collected tales of the lives of saints of old. Again, this is not what should be happening in a real university, where truth-seeking should be the telos, not cultivating foot soldiers for a missionary political ideology, whatever that ideology is. Now, what about the faculty? If you can believe it, the numbers among faculty are even more anomalous and eye-pop. As the former dean of Harvard College, Harry Lewis, has written, The political bias in our faculty is now widely accepted, end quote. Specifically, only about 1.46% of Harvard faculty in a recent survey said that they were conservative or very conservative, whereas 82.4% said they were very liberal or liberal. Now, that is a ratio of approximately 56 to 1. That means that among faculty, there are approximately 5,500% more liberal than conservative faculty. 5,500%. These are the people teaching our next generation of elites. Now imagine if nearly all of our faculty were Mormons or Islamic fundamentalists or some other conservative group. Perhaps you would be okay with that. I mean, Mormons are in general exceptionally nice people with large and loving families, and Muslim radicals at least believe in truth as objective, but of course practice your drawings another time. Yet I doubt you would be okay with this state of affairs among university faculty educating your children. So why put up with the symmetrically opposite ideology doing the exact same thing? If we would be against radical right-wingers disproportionately amongst our faculty, we should also be suspicious of the radical left taking over the faculty. Otherwise, we have a double standard, and it's a monoculture. And teaching and research and pursuing truth are all corrupted. And academic life has been severely biased by these trends. Beyond the protection of a few quantitative subjects, try to sit in on some classes at Harvard, and you'll hear an echo chamber so predictable that you could guess most of the discussion topics and their trajectory and conclusions that are reached before the class even starts. What about race? What about gender? What about class? It's quite predictable and fairly boring if you're a student. For example, a colleague of mine who's an expert in Islamic intellectual history tells me that intellectual diversity and freedom of academic inquiry is more common in a modern Islamic madrasa than at Harvard, which resembles more of a neo-Marxist DEI seminary. And anyway, the comparison is an insult to madrasas, where rigorous disagreement and different legal and ethical positions are entertained, as there are many competing and dissenting schools of Islamic law, and which are among the first institutions where systematic academic study emerged centuries ago. It's not a flattering comparison, but this is the reality we're in. Now, to be fair, if we look beyond the progressive liberal bubble, it is true that there are some minority of students at Harvard who are libertarians, meaning they're economic conservatives. The fact that we have a substantial fraction of Harvard students who contribute to discourse with economically conservative and libertarian perspectives is very promising. However, libertarian answers to social questions only really represent a fraction of conservatism. Social conservatism is actually quite opposed to libertarianism on many, many issues. So in terms of their moral foundations, work in moral psychology has shown that libertarianism is much more similar to liberalism psychologically. A libertarian is just a liberal with a few more IQ points, a bit more disagreeableness, and an extra emphasis on freedom, as opposed to some of the other moral foundations like care and protecting people from harm. So the disagreements at Harvard between what we call liberals and libertarian conservatives, quote unquote conservatives, is more akin to a local skirmish between two cousins of liberalism, whereas social conservatism, which is quite different, has a different emphasis on flag, family, and faith, is much more unique psychologically. So we at Harvard become innovative within a quite narrow frame of reference and exclude actual social conservatives from most discussions, even as they are more representative of our nation and the world, and would actually provide true intellectual diversity at Harvard. Now, what is the academic culture like for students? It's not very good. So in a totalitarian ideology or religion, everyone is like a possible informant against everyone else. Everyone's walking on eggshells unless they offend the dear leader and the ruling orthodoxy. Similarly, the majority of Harvard students, according to research, cannot speak openly in class and don't think that the university protects free speech. Students appear to have either been radicalized by each other or brainwashed by their administrators and professors ever since orientation day to internalize this soft totalitarianism, as an astounding number of students endorsed the use of violence to silence dissent. Specifically, Harvard ranked last among over 250 universities in the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, FIRE's 2023 ranking of universities on freedom of expression. It had the singular distinction of being the only university in the abysmal category of ratings. According to FIRE, quote, just over a quarter of Harvard students reported they are comfortable publicly disagreeing with their professor on a controversial political topic. Only roughly a third think it is, quote, very or extremely clear the administration protects free speech on campus, and an alarming 30% think using violence to stop campus speech is at least rarely acceptable, end quote. What about how the culture assesses ideas? I would say that except for the hard sciences and their cousin disciplines, Harvard doesn't really employ meritocratic standards of assessing ideas and knowledge or practice. From top to bottom, from grading students to hiring faculty to funding grants to awarding degrees to creating departments or proposing courses, most ideas are judged and reviewed primarily by their social and political and ideological utility and coherence to these prevailing orthodox beliefs. Students know this when they write papers for their tenured radicals to grade them, and therefore they cover their real views and arguments temporarily to get better grades. At the faculty level, I can give you one recent example. Two esteemed faculty from our Council on Academic Freedom with different viewpoints, Tariq Masood and Flynn Craddy, collaborated and proposed a genuinely new general education course called Hard Questions Searching for Veritas Across Deep Divides. This impressive course on heterodox thinking in the university aimed to encourage students to engage in civil discourse around ideologically and politically controversial questions. It aimed to teach, quote, how to disagree honestly and productively in an open society, end quote. This is exactly what a monocultural think tank needs in order to act like it is trying to become a university. These professors met with the administration multiple times, revised the syllabus after getting feedback, and the final version was a 13-page syllabus that's much longer than typical proposals. It was filled with extensive reading lists, pedagogical structure, clear descriptions of educational goals and metrics for evaluation. And I personally reviewed this syllabus. For whatever reason, it was still rejected. Even if it was accepted, this course would be a rare example of intellectual diversity, free and open inquiry, and debate across deep social, conservative, liberal differences. The examples of Veritas portrayed are endless at Harvard, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. Now, again, there are some exceptions in fields where there are very few ways to squeeze revolutionary fervor into an equation. But in general, everyone really needs to know that across Harvard's many schools and departments, academic conformity routinely supersedes scholarly excellence and independence of mind. Now, perhaps you're thinking this is just a problem of who has the podium and the microphone in the university. Perhaps this is just a problem of the president, the deans, and so on. I don't think so. Of course, there is a problem there as well. The problems are much deeper and more institutional, cultural, and so on, and baked into the way things are done. Entire fields of knowledge and research have become unrecognizable and have been gnarled more than your grandma's garlic knots. With a few exceptions, whole departments and fields of inquiry and research and teaching are distorted and disordered by the tiny slice of questions that are allowed to be asked in the first place. What gets funded and what gets published is an even smaller, misinformed fraction. So these problems infect the production and the transmission of knowledge itself. With DEI loyalty oaths, but even without them, given the ambient culture of orthodoxy, scholars are hired in a manner that shows a clustering of select concerns. And these concerns are predicted by the larger ethos and worldview of the university. It's quite particular and narrow. And because of this ideology, many other questions and methods are crowded out, and the emergence of other lines of inquiry on empirical or normative issues that are germane to the preoccupations of dozens of other competing ideologies are crowded out, tend to be excluded. Take any department you want. Look at what people study. Consider the space of all logically possible questions that any department scholars can entertain about the human condition in that department. Then look at what is actually asked and how it's answered. You'll typically observe an ideological sieve that filters out a large percent of centrist, liberal, conservative, and religious ideas and insights. Let me give you one example. Consider the ideas of African American conservatives, who are relatively ignored at Harvard and other elite universities when compared to their contributions at large. For example, Professor Thomas Sowell is arguably the most influential African American intellectual of the last 100 years, or at least he's in the top 5. But you're rarely going to find his writings on a Harvard syllabi. And you're rarely going to find a Harvard student or professor who knows Sowell's ideas in depth, or even his name. If they have heard of his name or his ideas, they will certainly know much more about the ideas of a radical left-wing writer, even when that writer is in comparison to Professor Sowell, an academic lightweight who has published far fewer scholarly articles and books, and of a much more mediocre nature, such as Ibram Kendi or Cornel West. So my concern is that we are averting our eyes to that logically possible space of compelling concerns and questions in research and teaching because of a preoccupation with a few very important topics that are coloring out the rest. Again, we become innovative and often self-congratulatory within a narrow frame of reference. As Harry Lewis, the former dean of Harvard College, noted, quote, "The Harvard curriculum has become heavily slanted towards recent fashions of the progressive left." Absolutely, Dean Lewis. Now, what about Harvard's admissions offices? These places are totally infected with progressive ideology. Harvard's admissions process for students is definitely non-meritocratic, and the most obvious victims have been Asians, Jews, and white people, who are thought of as overrepresented or oppressors. Why is this? Well, consistent again with the ideology, this woke ideology, this woke religion. People at Harvard are not judged primarily as individuals, but as members of allegedly privileged or allegedly underprivileged groups. Therefore, according to woke social justice, Harvard is required to hold different racial groups to different standards for admission and promotion, something that is totally immoral and illegal from an individual rights perspective, but totally consistent in this quasi-religious worldview. This is why the average Asian American freshman at Harvard has scored over 100 points higher on the SAT than their African American peer. And it's also why, according to detailed statistical analysis used in the recent Supreme Court case against Harvard, an African American applicant with a 95% chance of admission would only have a 25% chance if he or she was Asian American. I mean, how can two equally competitive applicants have a 280% difference in their chance of getting in? That's not 28%, which itself would be egregiously unfair, but rather 280% difference in competitiveness. Just because one person checked off a different box under the race question? How is that fair? Hundreds of Asian American and white students and Jews have been denied admissions primarily because of DEI ideology. And yes, I'm also against pretty much all non-meritocratic biases in admissions for legacy students, affiliates, kids, donors, kids, athletes, and so on. In addition, we're now seeing the same progressive logic applied to Jewish students, as their numbers have been decreasing at Harvard and across institutions like Harvard, as Jews are considered oppressors, according to left-wing thinking. According to Tablet magazine, Harvard has gone from being 25% Jewish in the 1990s and the 2000s to under 10% Jewish today. And it notes that among editors of the Harvard Law Review, Jewish representation has decreased by about 50% in the past 10 years. Why is this? It's obviously because of progressive left-wing beliefs and metaphysics in their worldview, which has an inherent anti-Semitic element. On Harvard's anti-Semitism, Professor Harry Lewis notes, when complex social and political histories are oversimplified in our teachings as Manichaean struggles between oppressed people and their oppressors, the powerless and the powerful, the just and the wicked, a veneer of academic respectability is applied to the ugly old stereotype of Jews as evil but deviously successful people, end quote. As an analogy, if the ruling religion on Harvard's campus was Hinduism, then the relative representation of non-Hindus on campus would drop over time due to all the biases against non-Hindus, the constant, inclusive Hindu excellence training programs, and pledges of allegiance when you're applying to get in and applying for promotion, and this hypothetical Vedic monoculture, which would crowd out meritocracy and people being judged as individuals, or replace Hinduism with any other ideology you want, and the same results would be seen. Similarly, if Harvard's ruling ideology was theocratic rather than a secular ideology, and the above-cited disparities in acceptance rates at similar academic levels of accomplishment were not concerning race, meaning not concerning Asian, Hispanic, white, and Black groups, but rather if it was about religion, for example, Christian versus Jewish versus Muslim versus atheist students, the whole apparatus would be shut down in a few weeks and everyone would be sued and shamed. Probably the whole university would be closed down by the federal government and turned into an amusement park with rides. However, because one never thinks of one's religion as a religion, just as obviously the right worldview, the right set of norms, and because we are swimming in a progressive secular religion, many people see DEI, affirmative action, inclusive excellence, diversity initiatives. It's just obviously the right thing to do, or what's without question a good thing. But we must understand that this is a very particular conception of justice that is not widely shared, as well as being, upon inspection, entirely incoherent and anti-scientific and immune to rigorous analytical investigation. So should we have diversity programs? Well, remember, what matters is diversity of thinking, diversity of ideas that contribute to an intellectual community. Any group-based diversity program that fails to filter and treat students as individuals only, not primarily as members of some intersectional, ethnic, or gender sexual group. Any such group will necessarily exclude and discriminate against whites, Jews, Asians, males, heterosexuals, and so on. And this is why understanding the ideology is very important. Just as salvation is the whole point of Christianity and Islam and other religions, discrimination on behalf of the oppressed, quote unquote, and the underrepresented, quote unquote, is the whole point of DEI, affirmative action, progressive ideology. Most Americans reject this kind of thinking, and it's clearly immoral and racist. And since the recent Supreme Court ruling on affirmative action, we can also say this is entirely illegal. Harvard actually treated all students and faculty as individuals with dignity and with their unique historical trajectories throughout life, with varying amounts of luck and suffering throughout life, and promoted intellectual diversity and free inquiry without cancellation, then no diversity program would be necessary. Meritocracy is the best source of diversity without immoral or illegal discrimination based on immutable characteristics. At Harvard or elsewhere, any diversity initiative that does not discriminate in this immoral manner and truly includes all people of all backgrounds will intrinsically dissolve itself and its reason for being. This is because the irreplaceable individual with a life that is unrepeatable in the entire cosmos is the ultimate minority. When we consider and respect the multi-layered complexity of being a unique human individual in a complex world, and avoid all of the group-based stereotyping that's inherent to diversity programming, we will find the entire discriminatory apparatus totally redundant and unnecessary, like having a second trachea going into your lungs, or a separate program for inclusive sprinting on a track and field team. Now, this whole way of thinking in this ideology also threatens freedom of speech. This reverse racism and reverse sexism and reverse sexual phobia we see in these DEI and affirmative action preferences also connect to the suppression of free speech. Because have you ever noticed that all of cancellations are in one direction? Pretty much most of them. It's no coincidence that most of the things that trigger apoplectic fits of mob outrage and then result in the injustices of suppressing scholarly inquiry, cancellations, biases in hiring and admission, humiliating struggle sections amongst the faculty. These are all systematically predictable based on the content of the triggering ideas. They almost always threaten radical left-wing ideology. Most of the challenges to free inquiry on campus today are coming from this source, this critical theory of progressive left, on trans issues versus biology in the case of Carol Hooven and Devin Buckley, on scientific but insufficiently woke analysis of policing in Professor Kit Parker's case, on views of marriage and homosexuality in Professor Tyler Vanderweel's case. So we cannot defend free speech without questioning that ideology as the default ethos and worldview on campus, which we all have to bow down to. A secular, non-sectarian university should not have a ruling ideology. The DEI critical theory pseudo-religion has little respect for objective evidence, and per Marxist and Foucaultian dogma, it tends to see everything as ideology and mere political power plays. Of course, except when it's using reason to make the argument for ideology and power. But logical consistency is not their strength. This ideology scoffs at aspirations of liberal procedural neutrality. It has little respect for the use of reason to understand the world. It prefers to focus on praxis to change the world. This is what most of the world already knows about Harvard, but we're in total denial about it. This ruling ideology, as I've described, this pseudo-religion, you can call it intersectional, Marxist, Manichaeanism, whatever you want to call it, critical social justice. It has the most invidious forms of stereotyping that you could imagine. In student admissions, in faculty and staff hiring, loyalty oaths, awarding of grants, promotions, grading students, and even other domains. People at Harvard are just sorted and categorized along this identitarian DEI hierarchy. The allegedly most oppressed are at the top, non-Asian and non-Jewish ethnic minorities, LGBT individuals, etc. And the allegedly most privileged are at the bottom as oppressors, Jews, Asians, whites, males, heterosexuals. I mean, it's just the most invidious form of discrimination in reverse. Status is accorded depending on how many intersectional points one gets across these different variables of oppression in the oppression Olympics. This calculative assessment by revolutionaries of different groups as more versus less oppressed is a temporary lapse in their commitment to praxis. First, as we have to use reason objectively to count oppression points. Also, ironically, the DEI true believers want to subvert all binaries except the oppressor-oppressed binary, which is a taboo beyond critical thinking and rebuke. But again, revolutionaries are not known for their superlative reasoning skills. And anyway, these radicals think of logic as an epiphenomena of power relations, which makes somebody wonder, what are you doing in a university if you don't believe in reason and logic? This silly and singular Manichaean lens binds and blinds and biases the entire university in the most shameful way. In doing so, this catechism forces everyone who confesses to it and conforms to it to commit all these sins that Harvard is ostensibly against, such as racism, sexism, etc. And the irony is very sad to see. Harvard today resembles the African American comedian Dave Chappelle's famous skit about Clayton Bigsby. If you haven't seen it, you should look it up. It's classic. This is the case of a congenitally blind Black person who tragically becomes a white supremacist. Today, Harvard is akin to Clayton Bigsby on the day he has his hood removed by others, and Clayton Bigsby realizes he's not who he thought he was. So what should be done? I have 7 suggestions, since some people are starting to realize that the Crimson Emperor has no scholarly clothes. Here are 7 suggestions. First, we need to ask whether Harvard merits federal funding. I don't really know. I doubt that taxpayers, if they really knew what happened at Harvard, would vote for their federal tax dollars going towards these thinly veiled and often explicit quasi-religious projects, discrimination against Jews, Asians, whites, corruption of teaching research, and the transmission of knowledge. It'll be for Congress and other agencies to assess whether such an ideological institution claiming the values of a university meets criteria for federal funding. I don't really know, but the question needs to be asked. Second, we have to end these DEI and diversity departments implementing affirmative action and all of their sub-departments and all their intersectional trainings and orientations. They are ineffective. We know that from research. They're divisive. They demean and patronize minorities as perpetual victims. The programming tends to be racist towards Jews, whites, Asians, sexist towards males, heterophobic, and more. Third, we need to end mandatory DEI diversity statements for students who are applying to college and for applicants to jobs at Harvard. These are really just pseudo-religious loyalty oaths. They are totally inimical to free, open university life, just as would be mandatory theological statements about one's commitment to the gospel or the Pali Canon or the Theravada Buddhism. Who would put up with that? Again, we don't think of this ideology as a pseudo-religion because we're swimming in it, but that's what it is. And no secular, non-sectarian university should have a ruling ideology. Fourth, we got to reform the culture and policies of Harvard to prioritize free academic inquiry, intellectual diversity, which grows out of intellectual freedom, institutional neutrality on the part of administrators and deans and presidents on issues, other than things that directly impact free inquiry, and a commitment to civil discourse without all these hecklers and people harassing you when you're giving a lecture or threatening violence. And overall, I agree with my former teacher and advisor, Steven Pinker's 5-point plan along these lines, which he published in the Boston Globe. Given the total saturation of wokeism at Harvard and the millions of dollars and thousands of staff hired to implement the Great Woke Commission, these changes will take decades and decades to implement if they ever even come to pass. So what do we do in the meantime? At this time, I think the first step with any problem, from bad breath to substance abuse to institutional corruption, is to admit you have a problem. Represent reality accurately. That's what I've tried to do in this piece. And as such, I propose that Harvard should change its name to the Harvard Institute. So it's going to match the naming practices of other sectarian institutes, because that's what it is. For reasons that I've discussed, Harvard doesn't deserve the hallowed name university at this time. Even if it is measured as an institute, Harvard would be among the more parochial, monocultural, and ideologically radical institutes. This is because there are a number of partisan think tanks that have much more intellectual diversity and free expression than Harvard. The Harvard Institute, compared to other partisan institutes, would be generally low performing on metrics of intellectual honesty and robustness. For instance, scholars at the center-right leaning American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., under President Arthur Brooks, were encouraged to seek out collaborations with think tanks that disagreed with them, to have a counter viewpoint when having panel discussions, and outside reviews of the Institute were regularly done by experts with politically contrary perspectives. So compared to this, Harvard's culture and policies resemble an ideological DEI church education and re-education program with an attached $50 billion hedge fund. Sixth, unlike the progressive and secular identity Marxists, I do believe in forgiveness and redemption. And so I think we need a pathway back for Harvard to embody the values of the university and win back its name. Everybody makes mistakes, and just like an individual, an institution can become brainwashed into an insular wilderness and wander off into the forests of Guyana on the verge of a left-wing revolutionary suicide. Therefore, if Harvard comes to resemble the values of the university, perhaps maybe in the next century, It may, after being on probation for some time, apply for a name change back to university. But the judges would need to be outside the university. Adjudicating metrics would need to be objective and transparent. No shadowy internal committees without procedure or transparency. No independent consultation by experts without names. This is because with the loss of trust and a betrayal of a sacred duty to truth and knowledge and teaching and research, from a crime scene to a broken marriage contract to a corrupted truth seeking institution, one does not determine when one is trustworthy again. That's for others to determine. Many decades of Veritas betrayed can't just be fixed by a quick self congratulation and throwing out a few events. We need to thwart the conformity and cowardice that is everywhere and commit to telling the truth as we see it. So I want to say something to my fellow professors. My friends, I am a conformist coward. I did nothing. I did not say or do anything when these neo-Marxist woke cultures were spreading over the past decades and when DEI persecutions were happening, both at Harvard and other universities like Yale, to Professor Nicholas Christakis, or Portland State University to Professor Peter Boghossian. When these shameful department chairs and deans refused to defend Carol Hogan's right to say what she believed to be true about sex, I really said nothing. When Tyler Vanderbilt was subjected to public shamings and struggle sessions for nothing more than having a deeply considered view on marriage, I said nothing. I deeply regret that I cowered out of a selfish concern for myself and a desire for stability and social acceptability. I watched with horrid amazement, waiting for each example to be an anomaly, then another example, and another, and here we are. 99.9% of you also did and said nothing. So now is the time to speak up. Now is when you too must stop being a conformist coward, because that is what we, you as well as I, have been for too long. People who excel in the university setting commonly have this risk-averse personality structure. We want to get along, we want to conform, but with honest self-examination, it's important for everyone to accept that in our hearts, we know this is what we are, and we have to commit to making things better. If not, then why did we spend decades of the best years of our lives stuck in a library if we didn't care about truth, merit, fairness, preservation, and transmission of true knowledge? We must believe that truth has an inherent luminosity, that it will set us free and lead to our flourishing. Otherwise, what the heck are we doing in a university? We should just go become political lobbyists and give up this whole charade. The truth is inherently offensive to those who primarily care about politics, whatever the direction of those politics. So now is the time we give up a couple friends in Martha's Vineyard and Aspen and Miami Beach and Napa Valley and say what we believe to be true. Live not by lies. I implore you to use the security of your tenure and say what you think is right or wrong. Now is the time to defend the truth-seeking institutions from this illiberal capture that has already become nearly complete. Perhaps it's already too late. I mean, America is the most free nation on earth. Universities are supposed to be the most free places to speak and pursue truth in this most free nation on earth, but they're not. They are not. One has more diversity of viewpoints, freedom of speech, and freedom from censure for wrongthink on Massachusetts Avenue in Cambridge, Massachusetts, as compared to just 10 feet away when you walk into the gate of Harvard Yard. When universities are corrupted, soon the rest of our nation will be too. And soon it will be too late. And eventually, remember, the revolution will come for you, and you'll be counted as an oppressor. So hide while you can, but you're going to be next. So now is the time to speak up. Stand up tall. Shed the cowardice and conformity, and tell the truth now. In the words of Dostoevsky in Crime and Punishment, your worst sin is that you have destroyed and betrayed yourself for nothing. End quote. Social respectability is nothing compared to what is at stake. It is much better for us to fight for the truth-seeking values of our university and our civilization, rather than to acquiesce in the shade, but on our knees. Thank you very much.